Hi and welcome back to this channel. Today we're gonna keep watching the Napoleonic War series from epichistorytv. It's been a great series so far, and this is Napoleon's invasion of Russia, 1812. It's gonna be very interesting. We heard from the last 3 videos that Napoleon is preparing or have already invaded Russia. It's gonna be very interesting to see this. It's very famous. I don't know a lot about this invasion. Yeah, let's just get into this. Original videos down below and let's go. One must never ask for more fortune than she can grant. Okay.
Russia, 1812. Napoleon invades his former ally with the largest army Europe has ever seen.
Okay.
But for the French Emperor, the decisive blow remains frustratingly beyond reach. Russia's resilience is unlike anything he's ever
Moscow is
encountered.
burning, okay.
And as winter closes in,
Wow.
his army begins the most infamous retreat in history.
Okay.
In 1807,
Friedland.
following his defeat of the Russian army at Friedland, Napoleon had travelled to Tilsit to meet the Russian Emperor Alexander. During their celebrated encounter, the two emperors formed a friendship and made an alliance. But it was not to last.
Yeah.
Over the next 5 years, relations between France and Russia cooled dramatically. The Russians were irritated by Napoleon's creation of a Duchy of Warsaw in Poland, which they regarded as meddling in their own front yard.
That makes sense because they're like what? From what was that, 1808 or something like that? Poland has been a thorn in Russia's back. And that's why they did the what's it called? The partition of Poland. I don't know how many there were, 3 or 4, right? And the last one was like in 1797 or something like that, right? I might do if there's a channel or video about that, I might check that out. Okay.
They feared it would lead to the return of a fully fledged Polish state, a traditional thorn in Russia's side.
Like I said.
Then there was Napoleon's offer to marry Alexander's sister, Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna, to cement
She lived long, wow. Huh. That would be interesting if he did that, wow.
their alliance. But the Romanovs hated the idea, and after a year of Russian prevarication, Napoleon married Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, instead. Later that year, Napoleon broke a guarantee made at Tilsit and annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, ruled by Alexander's sister's father-in-law.
Oh my... What?
Worst of all was the fallout over the continental system.
Yeah.
Napoleon's not very effective economic blockade against Britain, designed to cripple his most steadfast enemy. Alexander had agreed to join the continental system at Tilsit. But it was hugely unpopular in Russia and ruinous to her family.
Theoretically, it's a great proposal, right? It's basically kicking out Great Britain out of the economic system in Europe, in the continent, right? But the problem is, as much as Britain needs the continent needs Britain as well, and Britain has the biggest navy, naval supremacy, so they also have their colonies that they can go to. And they have Spain, Portugal, sort of. Ottoman Empire is not in there. Right? And Napoleon's allies need shipment from Great Britain and the reverse as well. So, alright.
During a period of economic crisis. When Napoleon found out that Russia was flouting the rules of the system and had resumed an illicit trade with Britain, he was furious. With both emperors accusing the other of bad faith, their two countries began preparing for war.
Okay. At Tilsit, Russia swore an eternal alliance with France. Now she breaks her oath. Does she believe us degenerate? Are we no longer the soldiers of Austerlitz?
Napoleon knew an invasion of Russia was a massive undertaking.
Okay.
Especially as he still had an unfinished war in Spain that was tying down more than 200,000 troops. Nevertheless, in 1811, he began to assemble the largest army Europe had ever seen.
Wow.
Around 600,000 men.
From different nations.
Less than half of them were French.
Okay.
The rest came from allied states across Europe. There was a Polish corps from the Duchy of Warsaw, led by Prince Poniatowski. A corps from each of the German kingdoms of Saxony, Westphalia, and Bavaria. From the Kingdom of Italy, as well as Swiss, Dutch, Croat, Spanish, and Portuguese units scattered throughout the army.
Austrian as well.
There were even contingents from Prussia and Austria, France's recent enemies, now uneasy allies.
I mean, that's pretty weird to have them at your north and south flank. Right? I understand they're your ally, but are they though? How many years did you fight wars against them? Right, I understand practically why Austria is the southern flank, because why wouldn't they? But okay, I guess he had faith in the Austrians because he married the daughter of the emperor, but that didn't work out so great for Marie Antoinette to save her from the revolution in France, so okay.
Some of these allied troops, such as the Poles and Germans, were as reliable as their French counterparts. Others were very inexperienced, or like the Prussians and Austrians, reluctant to be there at all.
Yeah.
This gigantic formation was deployed in 3 armies. The main force under Napoleon himself, another led by his stepson, Eugene, and a third led by his younger brother, Jerome, King of West.
Oh my, look at this. Alright, 3 different armies, but look at Napoleon's army. 217,000 men in the field. I mean, when was the last time this happened in Europe? Right, that big of an army, coordinated army, right? Not just scattered troops and warriors, but more of a sophisticated army. I mean, during Caesar's time, this was possible, right? Because they also had sort of the core system, right? Okay.
Neither of these two were experienced commanders, though one would distinguish himself.
I mean, the problem is, I thought, again, the revolution was based on merit. That's why Napoleon rose in the ranks. That's why the marshals that he appointed as marshals and his generals were there and rose through the ranks because of merit and not their family name, right? Now he's going against that, right? Although Eugene and Jerome could be maybe excellent generals, right? But how would we know that? There's no merit behind that statement, right? King of Westphalia, sure. Viceroy of Italy, okay. All right.
On campaign, the other would not. On their left
flank, see?
Marshal MacDonald
foreshadowing.
led 10th Corps with a large Prussian contingent.
Wow.
While the right flank was guarded by General Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps. Another 100,000 troops were in reserve, including Marshal Victor's 9th Corps. Initially, the Russians only had 220,000 men to face this juggernaut. Organized into Barclay de Tolly's 1st Army, Prince Bagration's 2nd Army, and General Tomasov's 3rd Army. They would be outnumbered 2 to 1. But in the run-up to war, Russia scored 2 crucial diplomatic triumphs. Sweden had been at war with Russia just 3 years earlier, a conflict which cost her Finland. By a curious turn of events, Sweden was now ruled by Napoleon's ex-marshal Bernadotte.
And that family still rules Sweden today. Bernadotte family, right? I think it's Jean Bernadotte's, great-great-grandson? Something like that. That rules. Or even further, I don't know. But okay, so Sweden lost Finland to Russia during the Finnish War 1808 and 1809. Okay. Pretty interesting. I thought Napoleon might have helped them, but I guess not. Okay. This secures Russia's right flank, right? But I mean, Russia is so wide. Look at that border, right? How many countries are in between or next to Russia's border, right? I understand Napoleon has a big force, but they're going to be very spread out. He has the core system to his advantage, but still. And I don't know, like we saw in Eylau, Napoleon maybe defeated the Russians, but they just withdrew, right? Towards Russia and then settled for peace, right? So, let's see.
But after Napoleon occupied Swedish Pomerania without warning, a furious Bernadotte promised Russia that Sweden would remain neutral. Meanwhile, a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire ended Russia's 6-year war against its southern rival.
Interesting though that Napoleon didn't make Ottoman Empire an ally. Probably because the Ottoman Empire was more on the British side, right? Because I believe the Brits sort of helped out the Ottoman Empire to defeat the French in Egypt. And I believe Napoleon was there. I might check out a video on that as well. Leave a comment down below to which channel has a good video on Napoleon in Egypt. Okay, let's go.
These two agreements secured Russia's flanks from any strategic threat and freed up troops to face Napoleon's invasion.
I'm about to embark on the greatest and most difficult enterprise I've ever attempted. But what has been begun must be carried through.
On the 24th of June 1812, French troops began crossing the Niemen River into Russian territory.
Epic.
The army was so large, the crossing took 5 days.
Oh my.
Napoleon's plan was to attack north of the impassable Pripet marshes and defeat Barclay's army, while Jerome pinned Bagration in place. French forces would then swing south to trap Bagration.
I mean, to me it looks like, okay, a decent plan, right? Attack Barclay at Vilnius. Jerome attack Bagration west of the marshes. But then what? Is Napoleon going east to Smolensk? Is someone going to Riga? Okay.
Napoleon expected the campaign to be over in 5 weeks.
Really? I mean, let's think about this. It could make sense, because how long was the campaigns in Austria, Prussia, right? They weren't that long, and comparably speaking, right, Austria is pretty large, and if that took, let's say, took a week, that campaign, or even 5 days, if you times the size of Russia to Austria, I mean, could make sense, but it takes time to just walk the distances of Russia to get to engage with the enemy, if the enemy wants to engage with you. Okay.
But the sheer size of the French army convinced the cautious Barclay that retreat was his only option. Prince Bagration, a much more aggressive commander by instinct, and often Barclay's fierce critic, was forced to agree. As they withdrew, they burned villages and crops, part of a scorched earth strategy to deny supplies to the enemy.
And what is Napoleon's biggest weapon was the core system, but it was also that he didn't rely on supply lines. Although he did that, of course, as well. But it was more of an escape route and more of a road where he can get information out of, instead of supply line. Right? He relied on living off the villages and farms, right? Instead of a big supply line. But now they're burning all that, the Russians, and retreating. I mean, that's a good tactic against Napoleon's tactics. Okay.
4 days, Napoleon had reached Vilnius. But Barclay was gone. To the south, Jerome failed to pin down Bagration. So when Davout's First Corps swung southeast to trap him, he'd already withdrawn to safety. Napoleon's younger brother was out of his depth, stung by the Emperor's criticism, humiliated when his troops were put under Marshal Davout's command. He resigned his post and returned to Westphalia. The campaign was already beginning to expose serious flaws in Napoleon's plan. Knowing his troops would struggle to live off the land in this impoverished region, he'd organized huge supply depots and transport units to feed the army.
I mean, that's pretty smart. That's a good counteractive. I mean, if you thought of that before the supply or before living off the land, I mean, that's a good countermeasure to that. But still, the more he's going east, the further the supply line has to be, and he has to leave corps to protect the supply lines. So he loses troops the further east he goes. And the Russians lose troops as well, but has the same amount of troops, sort of, right? And can just attack Napoleon when they want to, on their terms.
But wagons rolled slowly along Russia's bad roads, which were turned to rivers of mud by summer thunderstorms. The army had to make frequent stops to allow its supplies to catch up. Bad news for Napoleon's plan to catch the Russians, but a much-needed relief for the many thousands of young conscripts in his army, not used to hard marches day after day. Many were soon dropping out with exhaustion. Others deserted. There were also huge problems of command and control over a vast multinational army that was 3 times bigger than any Napoleon had commanded before. La Grande Armée, once famed for its speed of maneuver, had become a lumbering beast. After a pause to rest and regroup at Vilnius, Napoleon resumed.
I mean, you can compare it to when Napoleon defeated the Allies or the coalition at Austerlitz, right? They were a multinational army or different armies, right? Orders were difficult to receive and to give, right? Interesting.
His advance. Barclay continued his retreat to Vitebsk, where he hoped Bagration's Second Army would be able to join him. But Davout blocked Bagration's path at Sultanovka, forcing him to make for Smolensk instead. At Vitebsk, Napoleon clashed with Barclay's rearguard, but once more the Russians escaped, after setting fire to all the stores they couldn't take with them. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, on Napoleon's southern flank, Russian Third Army attacked and defeated the Saxon 7th Corps, forcing Napoleon to divert Schwarzenberg's Austrian.
300 miles away. I don't know which miles he's saying, but I mean, it doesn't matter, really. Yeah, the Third Army is just going to attack his reserves and what's that, 7 Corps, right? What is Napoleon going to do? Okay, he's going to maybe take Smolensk, and then what? He got Minsk, right? But you see, he's leaving troops. He has the reserve, Austrian reserve, right? He has to leave corps behind to to have his supply lines be intact. The Third Army can just come there and just destroy his supply line and escape route, right?
Corps to their aid. By the end of July, Napoleon had advanced 250 miles into Russia. 400
kilometers,
much further than he'd planned. And the long marches in extreme summer heat continued to take a heavy toll on his men.
Yeah. I mean, where is he gonna go? Because remember, at this time, the capital of Russia is not Moscow, it's St. Petersburg, right? So, and actually a funny thing, or not a funny thing, but they built St. Petersburg during the Great Northern War, and I mean, it has the spirit of Napoleonic War somehow, right? Because it's the same adversaries, only just in the east and north, right? and Denmark. Disgusting Denmark, whatever. Right? I might do a reaction series to that as well. Interesting. Let's see where we're gonna go.
Without fighting a major battle, the army had already suffered 20% casualties.
Oh my.
Exhaustion and illness, particularly typhus and dysentery.
Makes sense.
The army had entered Russia with 250,000 horses, but they were
Yep.
now dying at a rate of 1,000 every day from exhaustion and lack of fodder.
Yep.
It wasn't just cavalry horses that were dying, but the very horses that were supposed to haul the army's transport wagons, making
Makes
a bad
sense.
situation worse.
Yep.
This crisis in horsepower came just as the French light cavalry, Napoleon's eyes and ears, met their match in Russia's Cossacks.
If Napoleon had Cossacks in his army, he would have been Emperor of China long ago. Cossack prisoner interviewed by Napoleon.
Cossacks, self-reliant, proud, ruthless, and superb horsemen, didn't play by the same rules as other European cavalry. Every day they shadowed Napoleon's army, swooping in whenever they saw an easy target,
Yeah.
but melting away into the forests if they were attacked by a stronger force.
Makes sense.
Cossacks, as well as Russian partisans, made hit-and-run attacks on French supply lines and depots, forcing Napoleon to divert thousands of troops to their defense.
Again, this makes sense, right? But there's a difference here. Why didn't the Austrians do this? Why didn't the Prussians do this? Maybe they weren't as motivated as the Russians were. Life was very difficult in Russia. So maybe they wanted to make it better by defeating Napoleon somehow or distracting him and all that, right? So they thought maybe life would become difficult. Right? Life was already difficult and then Napoleon came, right? In Austria, Prussia, Spain is like the same, right? So pretty cool though.
Alongside Russian regular light cavalry, they also prevented French patrols from carrying out reconnaissance, which meant that Napoleon often lacked good information about roads or the enemy's whereabouts. Napoleon stayed 16 days at Vitebsk, resting his troops and considering his options. Among his many mounting concerns was the security of his long, exposed flanks.
Yep.
But at Vitebsk, he received news that Schwarzenberg had defeated the Russians at Gorodezhna.
Okay, pretty good.
Later at Polotsk, a French-Bavarian force fought Wittgenstein's Russian First Corps to a standstill. Napoleon's flanks were secure for now.
Sure. Yeah.
Although his main force had been reduced to less than half its original strength,
Wow.
Napoleon decided to push on to Smolensk and try to force the Russians into a decisive battle for the city.
Exactly, that's what he wants. He wants a decisive battle so he can defeat the army and then the country is basically wide open, right? Apart from partisans and maybe Cossacks, right? But I don't know, the Russians seems to just be withdrawing. Maybe they won't do it here. But it seems to me like that's their plan. They're withdrawing until they see a better ground to fight Napoleon on. And then they might turn away and or turn to him and attack him, right? And it looks like Napoleon is going to Moscow and not to St. Petersburg, so okay.
Barclay was indeed under pressure to give battle from fellow commander Prince Bagration and Emperor Alexander in St. Petersburg. The army's morale and Russia's honor required it, they told him.
Okay.
With the First and Second Russian armies finally linking up near Smolensk, Barclay decided to attack Napoleon's army, which he believed was concentrated around Rudnya. The offensive was led by General Platov's Cossacks, who surprised a French cavalry division at Inkova. But alarmed by false reports that Eugene's 4th Corps was outflanking him to the north, Barclay called off the attack. Napoleon, reassured that Barclay...
Indecisiveness and intelligence, they are lacking on the Russians, even though they have Cossacks and they can have scouting parties, right? But, okay.
His offensive posed no real threat, began a grand outflanking move to the south to take Smolensk and cut off the Russian retreat. The so-called Smolensk maneuver was Napoleon at his best, using Murat's cavalry to screen his movements and keep Barclay in the dark. The Emperor reached the Dnieper on the evening of the 13th of August. His engineers quickly threw up 4 pontoon bridges, and by dawn the next day, his army was across. Marshal Davout led a 2nd column across the river at Orsha. But a single Russian division, the 27th, fought a heroic fighting retreat from Krasny, delaying the French advance and buying time for Bagration to reinforce the Smolensk garrison. The chance for a surprise assault on the city was lost. And as the Russian army began to pull back, Napoleon displayed an uncharacteristic lack of urgency, even halting the army for a parade to mark his 43rd birthday.
What? Okay. Okay, maybe power has come to his head, right? But I mean, the maneuver didn't work, right? But he still can surround him, but it's just cavalry, so I don't know if you can surround him like that. Okay. Okay, let's see what he does then.
When the main attack on Smolensk began 2 days later, Napoleon opted for a frontal assault. 150 French guns battered the city, as 3 French corps attacked its medieval fortifications. The Russians resisted bravely, but Barclay, fearing encirclement, ordered another retreat. With
That's what
Smolensk
I'm
in
thinking,
flames,
right?
the Russians began to pull out. Just as the French fought their way into the city, to scenes of utter devastation. Bagration's 2nd Army withdrew first. As Barclay's army followed, its rear guard was caught by Ney's 3rd Corps at Valutino. General Junot, commanding the Westphalian 8th Corps, had orders to cut off Barclay's retreat. But having crossed the river, he did nothing, and the opportunity was lost. A furious Napoleon swore that Junot would never now win his marshal's baton. The Battle of Smolensk cost both sides around 10,000 casualties, and destroyed one of Russia's most historic and holy cities, but settled nothing.
But one thing though, if Napoleon loses sort of the same amount of troops as his enemy, that's pretty bad for Napoleon, right? And when Napoleon is, 400 kilometers into Russia? Yeah, that's pretty bad. That's 10,000 troops he could have used somewhere else. But I mean, he wanted to take Smolensk, so he got Smolensk. And the Russians withdrew. They lost troops and they withdrew. Okay. Before a month is out, we shall be in Moscow. In 6 weeks, we shall have peace. Why does he want to go to Moscow, though? I understand it's an important city for Russians, but it isn't the capital. And the Russians took the fight to Napoleon at Smolensk. They didn't lose or win. They lost the city, but inflicted the same amount of casualties on Napoleon, so it's a victory, sort of. So Russia's pride is still there. Him taking Moscow, I don't know. What is that gonna do?
After the missed chance to defeat the Russians at Smolensk, Napoleon paused once more to consider his options.
Exactly.
His men were weary and far from home, and it was already late in the campaigning season. He considered sitting out the Russian winter at Smolensk and resuming the campaign in 1813.
Interesting.
But now he was just 230 miles from Moscow.
Just. He was sort of the same amount of distance to Moscow as he was to Polish territory or Prussian territory, right? So, I don't know. Maybe staying at Smolensk is the best idea. Building or strengthening your supply lines, right? I don't know. Let's see what he does.
A century earlier, Peter the Great had moved Russia's capital to St. Petersburg.
Yep.
But Moscow remained its historic and spiritual heart, a prize for which the Russians had to fight. Napoleon,
Had they?
always a gambler, decided to push on.
I mean, that's true, he's a
The
gambler.
Russians faced their own dilemma. Emperor Alexander had experienced a kind of religious epiphany that summer and rallied the Russian people to the country's defense, describing the war with Napoleon as a war to save Holy Mother Russia from the Antichrist.
Okay.
For months,
I mean, that makes sense. In the eyes of religious people, especially Christians in Europe, France was the opposite. Same as Spanish people who were Catholic or even Protestant, doesn't matter, were against Napoleon because the revolution symbolizes tearing down of churches, cathedrals, right? Looting them, right? Persecuting religious people, right? So, I mean, it makes sense.
the emperor had received conflicting advice to stand and fight or retreat. Now he decided change was needed. The cautious General Barclay kept his job, but the emperor summoned General Mikhail Kutuzov to take overall command of Russia's armies. Kutuzov had been beaten by Napoleon at Austerlitz 7 years before, but he'd since won several victories against the Ottoman Empire and was a true Russian, loved by the troops. Although Kutuzov agreed with Barclay's strategy of delay, he saw that constant retreats were destroying the soldiers and the nation's morale. If Moscow was given up without a battle, the fallout could be disastrous.
Makes sense. Because Kutuzov, I believe, left Vienna to go north of Vienna, right? After they've marched, I don't know how long they marched, right? When Napoleon defeated, was it after Austerlitz or something? I don't know, right? So it makes sense that he wants to stand and fight for Moscow. Okay.
70 miles west of the city, near the village of Borodino, the Russian army prepared to make a stand.
Wow.
Europe was about to witness the bloodiest day's fighting of the Napoleonic Wars.
Wow. Oh my. Alright, that was pretty awesome. That was a very good build-up. He did invade. You can see some sort of writing on the wall. I don't know what it is. But, of course, it's them describing. Right? I wasn't Napoleon and saw what I saw on the map or whatever. But it looks like some form of writing is on the wall. The Russians are turning to Napoleon and attacking him and then retreating. And now they're going to do it the same outside of Moscow at Borodino. The bloodiest battle, the Napoleonic Wars. Wow. Up to this point, at least. That's going to be very interesting. Alright, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.